We actually do have some time for questions before we break.
So I'm wondering if girls are not identified because of all the things you said, but plus parents aren't recognizing that. If you could speak on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're right. There's definitely an identification. So if you have a parent who's on the spectrum, maybe not diagnosed, and then you have a child who's similar, they just think, oh, you know, they're just different, or they're creative, or they're just like me, and maybe they're not recognizing sort of the full scope. But it depends what's happening in other spheres of that child's life. So if that child goes to school or goes to other extracurricular involvements, and it could be that those people in the community are the ones that are starting to notice. So sometimes it still does come to people's attention, but sometimes it doesn't.
Hi. I'm having a hard time balancing respecting my child's want to be socially isolated and also encouraging her to be more social, because she wants to be social. She's hurt when she's not included, but she also goes to her room and shuts the door and wants to be by herself all the time. So how do I balance letting her be her with also trying to help her encourage friendships?
Mm-hmm. That's a really tricky one, because you do want to respect their need for downtime and they're quiet, but she's also said, I'm lonely, right? So you need to also hear that. Are you able to have that conversation about duality with her? Like that
Yes,
part
absolutely.
of her wants to be by herself and part of her wants to be social, and what can we kind of do about that? Okay, and what's her response?
She's the one that's not really able to explain her emotions very well. So I often, the answer I get is, I don't know. I don't know.
I think, you know, it's really hard to say, like, go out and make a friend.
Yeah.
Like, what? Like, how do you do that? I mean, even as adults, right? Like, at this stage in your lives, are you going out and making friends? Not so often. You know, it's hard. So I think, yeah.
I just want to add one more detail. So,
Okay.
for example, I'll look at her phone and she's getting all these texts from her friends, but then she doesn't even realize that she's supposed to respond.
Yeah. It does sound like she could use a bit of a social coach, like someone who could, not mummy, maybe, that could help her through that. Because those are some really basic, like, practical things that if she did this, then she could develop her friendships more. So there are some strategies to help her. I think for people who don't even know where to start, it's about first looking at what are some of your talents and interests, and where can we find other kids who have similar talents and interests. I mean, that's the most important starting point, because you want to make sure that the kids have something to talk about and something to connect over. And if she already has that, then it's about how do we take the friendships to the next level. Say, look how far you've come with these friends. You guys, they're texting you and everything. Now what's the next step? And I don't even know if you could pose it to her. Like my first approach is always to ask the person what they think. They might not always know, but what do you think the next step might be? And just be curious about it, right? How can we go from having these people texting you to you actually getting together with them? What's missing?
I know that in the DSM-5, although they made some comments about girls with autism, took away the word Asperger's, but they also added the social communication disorder. And I'm going to be a bit of a cynic and say they added that as a way to divert girls from not being diagnosed with autism. Because in my case, my daughter, at least to my mind, doesn't necessarily have a lot of repetitive interests. And so I was just wondering what your comments would be about the social communication disorder.
Well, I agree with you that it's possible that girls who present with autistic traits, but maybe their repetitive behaviors are more subtle, might end up with that label. What I'm also seeing with women who are seeking late in life diagnosis, they'll say, well, you just have social anxiety and depression. You don't have autism. And they won't even give them the social communication label because they've masked so well. So I think it is a risk. What I would say is that anyone trying to advocate for someone that they love or one of their students in an assessment is to document really, really well. Like I just take the DSM and then I put evidence in every single category, and you take that to the doctor because that's what the clinician is using primarily, right? So talk in their language, and then stress that the repetitive behaviors are maybe more subtle and not something that could be picked up on. But remember, repetitive behaviors could be repetitive thinking, which isn't always externalized, so that makes it challenging.
I have a daughter who has adopted the mean girl persona that you spoke of before, and is really reluctant to any sort of therapy, anything she feels is causing her to feel more shame about who she is, despite using all of these wonderful words here and celebrating autism in our home. However, I'm wondering what the best way, other than basically prompting constantly, to support a child in that position and keep her only two friends she actually has.
So what's the best way to do what?
To support her to continue those friendships without alienating her friends.
Well, are the friendships that she has, are they supportive and healthy friendships? Are they ones that you want to promote?
Friendships, yes.
Okay.
But she's constantly hurting her friends.
And what happens when you sit down and look at the text messages together and say, what do you think your friend's feeling when she gets that? What do you think your friend's thinking?
She has a very hard time holding multiple perspectives, and generally it can take weeks or months working with her psychologist before she can get there at all.
Yeah, it might take time. Another thing is to remove her from this situation and look at something like Mean Girls and watch the movie together and talk about their behavior and see first if she can recognize it in other people and then relate it back to the movie. Because it's much easier to talk about something from a safe distance than to talk about yourself that way. How do you teach complex emotions? So that's a very challenging thing to do. Some people actually arrive at it much more quickly than others. It's good to start with something known. So think about what the person really enjoys and then try to start maybe with positive emotions. Okay, so what emotions do you think you're feeling when you're doing your, let's say it's macrame, or you're sitting with your dog and you're petting your dog? What kinds of emotions might you be feeling? And you can prompt them and give them cues. And do that with things that you know is very aversive or very difficult for them, like anxiety, and talk about that. And the next step really is to try to tie it into the body, which is the interoception piece. So when you are doing your special interest or your passion interest, what does it feel like? What does it feel like inside your body? What does it feel like in your tummy? What does it feel like in your head? And then they can start to pair body feelings with emotions. And then what are you thinking? What are the thoughts you have with that? And so eventually it's this sort of triad of thoughts, feelings, and emotions, which is a CBT kind of approach, where they can start to build that emotional awareness piece.
So I find that saying a validating statement is not particularly difficult, but what I find difficult as a parent is hearing or seeing the same challenge and keep repeating the same validating statement, because their life and their behavior doesn't change. The challenges that they face doesn't change, and you hear exactly the same experiences being expressed over and over again. And how do you just validate? Do you just validate, or do you follow it with some kind of learning point? Because when you hear it over and over, and you sometimes try to say, well, in this situation, what have you done, or whatever, so that they can actually have some social learning happening from real life experience. I have a hard time figuring out how often do you just validate and how often do you want to make it a teaching point.
Okay, so, great question. I just want to say validation is like an opening. So it's a way to let them know you're listening and you care. That doesn't mean that you ignore the concern, right? So you can say, wow, it must be really hard for you to keep on having this difficulty over and over and over again. Like, I wonder what's going on here. Like, why does this keep happening? And then to say, like, why don't we break it down and look at this situation and try to understand it maybe from a different perspective? I just did this talk a couple weeks ago at Women's College Hospital to these psychiatrists to try to recognize autism. And I said, it's the clients who have the same behaviors over and over and over again, and they keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again, and they're not able to learn on their own. Right? Those are the ones that likely are on the spectrum. So what you're talking about, your child doing the same thing over and over again, they don't recognize that what they're doing is contributing to the problem. So it needs to be pointed out to them. You need to look at what are some other ways of doing this. So you might get a different outcome. right? So really trying to step back and get them to talk about it if they can, about what are some other ways to approach the situation or do things differently. Because I'm sure it's really hard for your child to have to go through the same difficult situation over and over again and not be able to get out, right? They feel stuck. So you want to help them get
I just
unstuck.
find that after a while, when you validate, like I always validate, and then we always go on to what do you think might have caused it or what happened in the situation, what you could have done differently. In some ways, it brings on anger that you point out what they are not doing correctly. And that's what I mean. It's really hard to find a balance of how often do you have to point out, especially since you're not changing anything. Mm-hmm. Or like you said, finding a different approach. Unfortunately, nobody has been able to, like I find they're just stuck and it's really hard to get them unstuck.
Well, another approach that is like a sort of proven approach is comic strip stories. So you write out with your child like what's happening and you draw it out and then you think about thought bubbles and thoughts and feelings so they can step outside of it and try to view the situation differently. But sometimes, and this is not good news, but sometimes people have to get stuck for a while before they get unstuck. And it's hard as a parent to see your child do that and not be able to propel them forward. If what you're doing isn't working, then you have to be creative, work outside the box, find other motivational tools or things.
Hi there. My question is in relation to the education piece. So my oldest is 19, and we're kind of in that transition to adult area. She desperately wants to be independent, so we're trying to give her as much ability to do that. So with education, educating people, doing a lot of like coaching and helping her script things beforehand so that she can approach people to send the email she needs to send or make the phone call she needs to make. One of my areas where I feel like I'm floundering a little and I'm not sure how not to be that parent is in the area of employment. So she's been going to some job interviews which are very stressful for her. And at the last job interview, she actually said, she dropped a little hint that, yes, I do know how to work with people who are marginalized because I'm someone with a disability and I've experienced it myself. And I was like, way to go. Mm-hmm. My question is, in that area of kind of saying something to her employer and helping them understand what could really help her, she doesn't seem to have the words for that, even with coaching. How do you handle that? Yeah, that's my question.
Sure. Is it something that the two of you could sit down with, or her and someone else outside of the job interview, and come up with a list of strengths? So usually you talk about like how my autism diagnosis would make me a really strong employee. So I'm loyal, I'm hardworking, I'm reliable, I have an amazing attention to detail, and then and approach it from that point of view, and then she can go into the job interview with it written down.
Hi.
Hello.
My question relates more to, some of the things we talked about so far include getting your daughter or the girl you're working with to open up and talk about it. How do you do that with someone who either never speaks or very rarely speaks?
Well, there's other ways to communicate besides words, right? So are you speaking about your daughter or just in more of a general sense? Specifically my daughter, but she's only 7, but I also work with a lot of girls of various ages on the spectrum, and I find that I either have, as you mentioned earlier, girls who can chat and do chat a lot, mm-hmm. and then the opposite, where there's very little verbal communication. So I find having people use artwork can be really useful. So communicating how they feel through art, trying to write things down if they have the language to write things down. But then there's also just ways to elicit communication. Some are better than others. So a lot of people find if they're engaged in a parallel activity, they're much more likely to get mm-hmm. the person to share. So if you're going on a walk together and you're both facing the same way, so there's no eye contact issues, and the movement helps to calm the body down and helps them relax. They can communicate more, or in a car ride, or like while they're doing an activity that they enjoy, like do it with them and join them and just try to engage with them that way. But ultimately you have to do it on their terms. You have to meet them where they're at and try to be, again, creative as best you can. It's not easy. But.
No, thanks.
Okay.
How can an adult woman pursue a diagnosis? And that, of course, all depends on
Where you live.
where you live. Do you have money for a private diagnosis? Is there a psychiatrist who's, if not, is there a psychiatrist paid through Medicare who can provide a diagnosis? They're in very short supply here in British Columbia. What's your experience from Ontario?
My experience is that it is next to impossible to get an adult diagnosis of autism if you're a woman, unless you have $3,000 to pay for the 1 or 2 specialists who recognize it. And I wish that that wasn't the case, but it is. I recently met with someone who's involved in an adult diagnostic clinic that is covered by OHIP, and I was really dismayed to hear his response. It was basically, well, I know that the DSM doesn't cover women, and I know that the ADOS-2 doesn't cover women, but if I diagnose someone with autism and then I get taken to court, how can I justify this diagnosis? And I said to him, well, can't you use your clinical judgment? He said, oh, no, but I would still have a problem with the law. So he's looking out for protecting his interest. I've advocated about that to the person who kind of is above him, but I have to say, that is one of the, the leaders sort of in autism diagnostics, and even they are not recognizing women. So you have to find someone who that's their area of expertise or interest, and it's few and far between. But if you can't, then you need to go in and advocate for yourself with your list of, this is my developmental history, these are all the struggles that I had along the way, these are all the co-occurring conditions that I have, and these are the reasons why I believe I'm on the spectrum.
And just, that's a terrible experience story in Ontario, but to say that in British Columbia, there are very few people doing a diagnosis, but in fact, they are fairly well up on the needs of women, and there isn't that kind of prejudice here. It's not often I can say anything terribly positive about what's happening in BC, so I just wanted to give that bit of information.
Well, I should point out that it is age-specific, so there's one person who's phenomenal with girls and women, but he's only allowed to see people up to the age of 25. So this is in Toronto I'm speaking about. I'm not going to mention any names, but if you're older than 25, then sorry. But yeah.
I have one more question that's popped into my phone from someone online who writes that she has a daughter who was diagnosed at age 18, and the daughter is refusing to accept the diagnosis. Do you have I think this is a great question. Do you have any suggestions about how to help her come to terms with it? Any resources that might be helpful?
Part of me says that people have to come to their own acceptance in their own time. I mean, you really can't force a label or a perspective onto someone. It's just going to have the opposite reaction that you're hoping for. So that's number one. Number two is to kind of like plant things maybe around the house or send them little emails about little positive things that you see about women with autism so they can see that other perspective, because right now probably when they hear autism they're thinking of a little boy who's obsessed with Thomas the Tank Engine who's rocking in the corner, and they don't know that there are other definitions or other versions or variations about what autism in girls and women looks like. So I think it's about sort of expanding their perspective, but also respecting that if they're not ready, they're not ready. And I know that's hard to hear, but sometimes you just have to be okay with that and let them know that when they are ready, that you have some resources available to them.
Hi. When we were watching that video, and Christine, is that her name? Yeah. She was talking about when she would read books, even those characters were like her friends. Like that's how intense it was. I'm just wondering, how would you handle a situation like with a girl, like my daughter, who is on the spectrum, and every inanimate possession of hers is her favorite. And the moment she loses it, it is her favorite. And the intensity of that loss is like grief. It is, and she, like if she misplaces her iPad, for example, when she finds it, the tears and the relief and the kissing it and talking to it, like it's like personified, like it's an actual person. I'm just wondering, how can we support that and handle that and help her through that?
Well, what you're describing is certainly something that I see. I've seen people grieve over the loss of characters. They felt like they were in a close relationship, and then someone else drew that character too, and it's like they lost that direct one-on-one monogamous relationship with the character. Like it can get, this is what we were talking about before, but this sort of blending of reality and fiction. And in terms of inanimate objects remain the same, right? They don't judge. They don't have any special rules about interaction, so they're very soothing and very predictable. So you can understand how this attachment gets developed. It helps them feel safe. It's a part of who they are. So I would go right back to the validation piece first. So if they really feel that they're grieving, she really does believe that she's grieving. Just like my client thought that she was breaking up with this cartoon character, right? I mean, you have to actually be there and imagine what it must be like for her to feel that way. You know, I'm so sorry for you that you lost it. That must really hurt. And then shift over to how do you think you can move on from this, right? So you're planting the seed that she should move on at some point. She can't get stuck on her lost object. But these feelings are very real. I can't really stress them enough. Like someone else around their teddy bears, I think, was saying they had a fire. And they lost their stuffies, and it was like all of them died. Like she had to go through a full-on grief process, and then they tried to replace them, and it wasn't the same. You know, she knew the difference. So when you say they personify them, they don't personify them, because if they personify them, they wouldn't actually be close to them, right? Because they're not people. That's the whole reason why they like them so much.
Hi there. I'd never heard of that PDA, the pathological demand avoidance, but my daughter very much has that. Is there anything more? I like those 2 slides you did on it, but is there anywhere more I would look online or?
Yeah, there's so in the UK, they have a real wealth of information on this that's online. So the Pathological Demand Avoidance Society, if you just Google that, you'll get some great videos, some handouts, some teaching tools. It's really developed out there.